Look at the lorries on any British motorway today. DF, Volvo, Scania, Mercedes, MAN, every single badge is foreign. But in 1960, Britain built more truck brands than almost any country on earth. AEC, Bedford, Leyland, Foden, ERF, Guy, Scammell, Thornycroft, Albion, all gone. This is how Britain lost its entire truck industry. Factories once dotted the map of Britain, each one tied to a badge that carried not just a name but a story. Southall in West London was AEC country, where the clang of presses and the smell of hot metal filled the air as generations built the Regulator and Matador trucks that hauled everything from army gear to double-decker buses. In Dunstable, Bedford's sprawling complex churned out the TK and CF, sending lorries across the world and giving the town a sense of purpose that echoed through every shift change. Leyland itself was more than a town. It was a symbol, its name stamped on buses and trucks that moved both people and freight from the 1950s through the 1970s, its workforce proud of the Titan and Retriever models that bore their signature. The story stretched far beyond these three. In Sandbach, the Foden family's workshops shaped the village's fortunes for nearly a century, while just down the road, ERF's lines kept West Bromwich humming with the steady output of the 400 series and the 690 series rigs. Guy Motors in Wolverhampton, established in 1914, was the backbone of the city's engineering scene, its quad and Arab models rolling out to serve in war and peace. Watford's Scammell plant specialised in heavy haulers, producing the Pioneer and Crusader for jobs that demanded muscle and reliability. Basingstoke's Thornycroft works, founded in the late 1800s, gave the town its industrial backbone, while Glasgow's Scotstoun district was known for Albion trucks, Viking, Aberdonian and Clydesdale models that became fixtures on Scottish roads. Each mark was more than a product, it was the heartbeat of its community. The AEC badge meant skilled jobs and apprenticeships in Southall. Bedford's Dunstable plant shaped the daily rhythm of an entire county. Leyland, Foden and ERF provided the kind of steady employment that built schools, supported shops and filled local football terraces on Saturdays. In Wolverhampton, the closure of Guy's factory would one day send shockwaves through the city's metalworking trades, while in Watford, the end of Scammell meant the loss of a niche, high-skill workforce that had built some of the world's toughest trucks. At its height, Britain's truck industry offered a scale and diversity matched by almost no other country. The names on the badges stood for something local and tangible. Each closure would later leave a scar, not just in lost jobs, but in the unravelling of local identity. Before the mergers, before the foreign competition, before government intervention and economic reality set in, these factories and their communities formed a living network, one that seemed as permanent as the roads their trucks helped build. Leyland's rise from a Lancashire workshop to the heart of Britain's truck industry set off a chain reaction that would reshape everything. In 1962, Leyland Motors took over AEC, absorbing not just a rival but a whole culture of engineering rooted in Southall. It was more than a business deal. It was the first step in a campaign to gather up the country's scattered truck makers under one roof. Over the next few years, Leyland pulled in specialist firms like Albion, Guy and Thornycroft, each with its own legacy, workforce and loyal customer base. The logic was scale. Bigger would mean stronger, more efficient and better able to compete with American giants and the new threat from Europe. But the new conglomerate quickly revealed its own fault lines. When British Leyland Motor Corporation was created in 1968, merging Leyland's truck and bus operations with British Motor Holdings cars and vans, the result was a sprawling group with dozens of product lines, aging factories and overlapping management. Instead of streamlining, the corporation inherited nearly 500 separate union agreements. Every plant, every division, every badge had its own deal, its own traditions and its own resistance to change. The hope was that this industrial giant could marshal resources and modernise. In practice, it became a maze of internal rivalries and compromise. Leyland's managers faced impossible choices. Rationalising the product range meant closing factories and killing off historic brands, decisions that sparked strikes and political backlash. Attempts to standardise parts or merge design teams ran into deep-seated loyalties and local pride. The company spent years negotiating with unions, often more time than actually building trucks. As the outside world changed, the corporation found itself locked in arguments over which badge should survive and which plant should get the next investment. By the mid-1970s, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Productivity lagged behind foreign rivals, quality suffered as cost-cutting collided with outdated machinery and demoralised workers. In 1975, with the company teetering on the edge of collapse, the government stepped in with a massive rescue package. The move kept the lights on, but it also cemented the sense that British Leyland was too big to fail and too unwieldy to truly fix. The conglomerate's centralisation meant to create a champion instead hollowed out the diversity that once made Britain's truck industry so resilient. The stage was set for outside competition and further decline, as the old independent spirit of AEC, Albion, Guy and the rest faded into the corporate background. By the late 1960s, the ground was shifting under Britain's truck makers. A new kind of lorry began appearing on British roads, one that looked, felt, and even sounded different. Volvo's F88 arrived first, followed closely by the Scania 81. These Swedish trucks did not just compete on price or reliability, they changed what drivers and operators expected from a working vehicle. Inside the Volvo F88, drivers found a proper sleeper cab with a real mattress and central heating. The seat was air suspended, the steering effortless, and the noise level dropped so low that long motorway hauls became less of an endurance test. Scania's 81 series pushed things further, a double-bunk sleeper, independent front suspension and a cab-over layout that gave drivers a clear view and a quieter ride. In winter, the heating system kept the cab warm without roasting the engine, something unheard of in most British trucks of the era. For operators, these features were not just luxuries. Long-haul firms began to notice that drivers preferred the Swedish rigs. Turnover dropped, fatigue eased, and breakdowns became less frequent. Trade magazines such as Commercial Motor ran side-by-side tests and described the F88's cab as more like a hotel room than a workhorse. Managers who once bought on price started weighing comfort and reliability just as heavily. A 1972 survey found that nearly 2/3 of fleet managers now put driver comfort at the top of their list, a dramatic change from just a few years before. British trucks, by contrast, still ran with heavy steering, noisy cabs and canvas bunks. Leyland, ERF and Foden scrambled to upgrade their designs, but the new models arrived years after Volvo and Scania had already won over the best drivers and secured the biggest contracts. By 1975, British-built trucks made up less than a third of new registrations, down from nearly 60% a decade earlier. The shift was clear, the Swedish approach had set a new standard and the market followed. Bedford's story did not end with a failed product or a lost contract. It ended with a government decision that closed the door for good. At Dunstable, Bedford trucks had once rolled out in their thousands, serving armies, builders and delivery firms across the world. By the early 1980s, the plant's future hung on a knife edge. General Motors, Bedford's American parent, drew up a plan to keep production alive, a proposal that would have injected new investment and possibly linked Bedford's future to Leyland's own truck operations. The scheme required government approval and, crucially, financial support from Whitehall. Inside cabinet offices, the plan was debated and dissected. Officials in the Department of Trade and Industry worried about the effect on British Leyland, which was already dependent on state support. Allowing General Motors to step in, they argued, would tilt the playing field and undermine their own rescue efforts elsewhere. In July 1985, the government delivered its answer. The proposal was rejected. There would be no partnership, no new capital. Bedford was left to face the market alone. Production at Dunstable fell sharply. By early 1986, output had dropped to a trickle. The last Bedford heavy truck left the line that June, and within months the factory gates closed behind more than 1,000 redundant workers. The shutdown was not the result of a sudden collapse in demand or a fatal design flaw. It was a political choice, one that sacrificed a major employer and a historic brand to protect broader industrial policy. For the workforce, the sense of loss was sharpened by the knowledge that survival had been possible if only the deal had gone through. In Dunstable, the end of Bedford was not just a business failure, but a decision made in distant offices, far from the noise and grit of the shop floor. The closure set a precedent, showing that the fate of entire communities could be decided by the priorities of policymakers, not by the workers or even the market itself. In Sandbach, the Foden and ERF names once carried the weight of a century's work, their badges stamped on trucks that powered everything from coal deliveries to motorway construction. Both companies grew out of the same family feud in the 1930s. Two branches, two visions, but the same relentless pride in building machines that lasted. By the 1980s, that legacy stood on fragile ground. ERF, which had survived the first waves of closures by shrinking output and cutting costs, saw its workforce fall from 1,400 to just 600. The company was sold to Western Star of Canada in 1996, then passed on to MAN of Germany in 2000. The Middlewich plant closed its doors in 2002, and by 2007 the ERF badge disappeared for good. Foden's path was no less turbulent. Entering receivership in 1980, the firm was bought by the American giant PACCAR. For a time, the Sandbach factory kept building trucks under new ownership, but the sense of independence was gone. In 2006, PACCAR retired the Foden name, ending a run that stretched back to the horse-drawn steam wagons of the Victorian era. The last trucks left the line in silence with no fanfare and no promise of a revival. Elsewhere, the list of closures grew longer. AEC's Southall plant shut in 1979. Guy's Wolverhampton works closed in 1982. Thornycroft's Basingstoke factory went quiet in 1969. Scammell's Watford site followed in 1988. Each closure erased not just jobs, but the identity of whole towns. For the engineering families of Sandbach and West Bromwich, the end came not with a single blow, but with a slow, grinding erosion, ownership passing overseas, production lines falling idle, and the last trucks rolling out under foreign direction or not at all. By the time the dust settled, what remained of Britain's independent truck industry was owned by Canada, Germany, and the United States. The names that had built Britain's roads were now museum pieces, their factories converted or demolished, their communities left to remember what once was. Leyland's journey, once the pride of Lancashire, reached its final crossroads in the late 1980s. After decades of absorbing rivals and surviving government rescue, the company faced a world that had changed beyond recognition. In 1987, Leyland's truck division entered a joint venture with DAF, the Dutch manufacturer. The new entity, Leyland DAF, was floated on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, tying the last great British truck brand to a European partner. For a brief moment, there was hope. In 1988, the DAF 95, built on Leyland's production lines, earned the International Truck of the Year award. It seemed like proof that British engineering still had a place in the modern market, even if the badge now shared space with a Dutch name. But the optimism did not last. The early 1990s brought a recession that hit commercial vehicle sales hard. In 1993, DAF NV collapsed into bankruptcy. The Leyland plant, which had survived every wave of closure and consolidation, managed to stay alive through a management buyout. Workers who had weathered decades of uncertainty now found themselves part of a smaller, leaner operation, stripped of the scale and security that had once come with the Leyland name. The story did not end with independence. In 1998, Leyland Trucks was bought by PACCAR, an American corporation already known for owning Foden. The factory in Lancashire kept building trucks, but the decisions now came from Seattle and Eindhoven, not Leyland or London. For the people on the shop floor, it was a strange mix of pride and resignation, proud to still be building, but aware that the era of British-owned, British-designed trucks had finally run out of road. 5 forces converged to dismantle Britain's truck industry. First came consolidation. Leyland absorbed AEC, Albion, Guy, Thornycroft and Scammell, believing unity would bring strength. Instead, it erased the distinctiveness of each brand, leaving a single, cumbersome entity with redundant factories, overlapping models and a web of union agreements that stifled flexibility. Second was management failure. The aftermath of mergers brought indecision. Product lines blurred, innovation slowed, and the energy that once drove British engineering faded. Managers faced impossible choices. They could shut plants and risk strikes, or keep them open and drain resources. The result was inertia, with engineers sidelined and boardrooms locked in endless debate. Third, Swedish competition arrived. Volvo's F88 and Scania's 81 set new benchmarks for comfort and reliability, outclassing the rugged but outdated British lorries. Drivers drawn to the smooth ride and modern features persuaded fleet operators to switch. By the time Leyland's T45 responded with updated technology, the market had already shifted north. Fourth, government interference distorted the industry's course. State bailouts and policy decisions kept factories running but warped priorities. Bedford's fate, determined far from the assembly line, showed how political interests could override the needs of workers and local communities. Instead of stability, the sector lurched from one crisis to the next. Finally, harsh economics delivered the final blow. The UK market was too small to sustain so many brands. Foreign rivals operated at a scale British firms couldn't match. Costs rose, margins shrank, and survival meant shrinking, selling, or closing down. No single factor caused the collapse. It was the collision of consolidation, mismanagement, foreign competition, political interference, and unforgiving economics that ended a century of British truck building. Britain's truck industry vanished. Not by fate, but by a chain of decisions, mergers that erased independence, management that lost direction, rivals that set new standards, and interventions that distorted reality. Today, every lorry on British roads tells that story. The lesson is simple. Industrial decline is rarely accidental. Which British truck do you miss most, and who do you blame? Share your thoughts in the comments below.